Welcome back, everybody, to Magic with Randy. I am Randy, and today we're talking about RC Portland and what were the winners, the losers of this metagame, and kind of what has shaken out and what has given us kind of the best result. What's doing well in the meta, what's not doing well in the meta, and kind of what we can expect moving forward with the other RC we have here next month in March in Charlotte. US does have two RCs, so twice the fun here. That being said, though, before we get into it, guys, if you like what you're seeing, you like what I'm doing, go ahead and leave a like on the video. Subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out. And if you like these kind of like metagame breakdowns as well as going over what's going on in the meta, go ahead and check out my podcast I have. I'll have a link down below. I do it with Dakota. He's over on his channel, Crawl Daddy 23. He does a bunch of the other Magic stuff. We kind of just have a fun time, goof around, breaking down the meta, what we think is going to happen, things like that. So feel free to check that out. I have a link down below. And let's get started here. So starting off with the day one metagame breakdown here. This lovely little graphic they had here. So they put all the breaches together. So, 4-color and Teamer. Those are kind of the two big ones of the different grinding station breach deck running around. Had 203 copies in it, 19.7% of the meta. Almost 20% of the meta was Breach, which is kind of surprising for me because I kind of thought this deck was good. I thought this deck was a very known quantity that it was going to show up, but I did not in remote regard have this at a 20% meta. And then they had all the energy decks, so Boros, Jeskai, Mardu, Naya, all the different variants running around. They had them all lumped together at 203 players as well, and 19.7% of the meta. This is not surprising to me at all. We kind of thought that Boros Energy going into this tournament was going to be the most played deck. Pretty much anyone would have almost said that was like a give me or a free thought process that Boros Energy is going to be the most played deck, or that the energy decks are going to be the most played. Really not any kind of surprising factor there. But the fact that Breach was right next to it with the same amount of people is a little wild to me. Then we had Eldrazi Ramp with 151 and basically 15% of the meta, 14.7. Not surprising at all. I think that the Eldrazi Ramp deck is probably one of the best things you can be doing in the game. Right next to Breach, it has a good game plan against the energy decks. It has a game plan against the Breach decks with Karn the Great Creator as a main deck slot. The Blink decks can be a little bit challenging if they get ramping up with their land destruction type package they have going on. But other than that, it's usually a pretty easy matchup. Oculus can be a little bit of a challenging matchup for Eldrazi, but you still have a bunch of cast triggers that Oculus struggles with game 1, and game 2 you can kind of fight through that hate as a whole. So I thought Eldrazi Ramp would be right around this kind of percentage where it would be about 15% of the meta. I was thinking probably more closer to like 10 to 12. I didn't think it'd be as high as 15, but it's not surprising to see that deck do so well. And then the Blink decks, Orzhov, Selesnya, Bant, Mono White. Haven't really seen the Mono White Blink deck, but mostly it's the Orzhov. That Orzhov Blink deck, or what was called, Orzhov Sewers, is what it kind of got nicknamed as. Because it was playing a bunch of, kind of like quote unquote shitty cards, essentially. Right there with 96 players and 9.3% of the meta. Not too surprising there. I thought that Blink would be just kind of be a breakout weekend for it, where it was going to show up a lot more than people expected. The deck has been doing really well. Young Dingo is probably one of the biggest components of that. Not so much that he has been a big advocate of the deck, but he did have 4 back-to-back challenges that he top 8'd with, which gave it a lot of notoriety. Just when you have one person doing top 8ing challenges back to back to back to back, that does give it a lot of notice, a lot of eyes on that deck. That being said, and then we had the Oculus deck, Dimir and Esper at 5.6% of the meta, 58 copies. Honestly, I'm surprised it was that high. I think that Oculus has kind of showcased that this deck has fallen off hard. We go back and look at the European RC. We saw that had an abysmal conversion rate. It had a 4% conversion rate or something like that. It was something ridiculously low where it just didn't convert. Obviously in Canada it did a little bit better where it converted a little bit higher than that, but just kind of showcased that I don't think Oculus is game plan or is prepared for the meta as a whole. I think it's a stretched too thin for what it needs to do. The counter spells aren't necessarily as great as they used to be, and it's not in the best position in my opinion. Then Amulet Titan with 56 copies at 5.4%. A little surprised that it was that high of Amulet Titan players. That being said, it's not too surprising. Amulet Titan has kind of been a playable deck since its inception, basically. It's kind of weathered through a whole bunch of different variants. Whether or not, is always the best thing to be doing is controversial, but Amulet Titan has always kind of been around in the modern metagame ever since Summer Bloom, essentially. Then we had Domain Zoo with 2.3% with 24 copies. A little surprised to see that do so high. I do think that is probably in regard to the fact it did so well in the European RC. We kind of showcased that, Domain Zoo is not a deck to be forgotten about. We had 23 people on Ruby Storm because they did not want to qualify for the Pro Tour. I think Ruby Storm is a terrible deck as a whole in the metagame. It has a lot of hate. It has a lot of problems with fighting through hate that people are already playing for, like the Breach decks and everything else. So it just doesn't seem, seems to have a great game 1, and then you have to win game 2 or 3. That is a lot more challenging to do than it would seem. Mono Blue Belcher right underneath it with 22 copies at 2.1%. Surprising it's that so low. I thought Mono Blue Belcher would be right around 5% just because it had a good game against against Energy, which has been popping up a lot. It can beat the Eldrazi decks, it can beat the Breach decks, it can kind of beat everything in the metagame because counterspells are kind of good for that. And the opposite direction where, Oculus isn't as good, but of course, Belcher having the I win button with Goblin Child Belcher gives it a lot more edge than Oculus actually has to beat down. That's why I think the counterspells are so much better for that. And then we had 15 players on Golgari Yawgmoth. Surprising. Honestly, Yawgmoth seems really ill-prepared as it stands right now. And then we have Reanimator, Eldrazi Tron, Dimir Mill, Jeskai Control, and Jund Creativity all there with, 1% or under, and then 132 other decks, so just a spattering of other things. Overall, this seems like a very healthy metagame as a whole. Obviously, we have a little bit of a top-end heavy, with the energy decks and the breach decks being 19% and Eldrazi Ramp at, almost 15%. But I don't think this is a too terrible of a day one metagame we can expect. Honestly, like I said, the biggest surprise, I think, and the biggest takeaway here is that people are prepared to play Breach. I thought that there might be a little bit of a chokehold on the Breach deck just with trying to get a hold of 4 Mox Opals. Those are relatively a very cost-expensive thing to get. It's like $700 for a playset. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that, people who play these these RCs don't have the ability to get a hold of them or maybe borrow some from, borrow 4 from 4 different commander players they know or things like that. It was just kind of surprising that 203 people were registering Breach. That being said, I did think it was probably one of the best decks to be taking, so it's not too surprising. Just I did think that cost might be a little bit of a hindrance or just a challenge to get a hold of the Mox Opals in general. That being said, moving on into our day 2 breakdown, we see that Breach still the number 1 deck in day 2 with 68 copies and 28% of the meta. Energy dropping down to 41 copies and 17%, so definitely took a hit there. Lost 2% of his meta share. Eldrazi Ramp going up in his meta share with 16.3. Blink going up as well with 9.6. Then Amulet Titan had 15 copies with 6.3%, and then Oculus still doing well, kind of surprised. Still this high up with 4.6%. And then Ruby Storm and Belcher tied at 2.5. Domain Zoo with 4 copies. Samwise, a deck that wasn't even on the day 1 metagame breakdown, put 4 copies into day 2. Golgari Yawgmoth only putting 3 copies. Seems a little high even still. Same thing with the Mono Black Necro. Wasn't on day 1, now is on day 2 with 3 copies. Eldrazi Breach, same thing, now with 3 copies. And then Jeskai Control and Jund Creativity with 2 copies each. So, as we can see, obviously Breach was, probably the correct choice. Obviously, it was the most played deck, but still putting in 68 copies into day 2 compared to Eldrazi, or compared to the energy decks, it was the same number of people, only put 41. So clearly, Breach is still a very good deck to play. I don't think anyone's surprised by this factor, this information going on that Breach did so well. I think that it is kind of showcasing, this is probably the deck to beat, or probably one of the number 1 decks in the format. If I had to guess or argue, I would definitely put Breach at the best, if not the best, if not tied for the best deck to play in the format. Eldrazi Ramp still showcasing that it's very strong, and I think it has a good game plan against that. Breach deck, which is what gives it an edge. Same thing, it has a good game plan against Boros Energy, or the energy decks in general. Being able to have board wipes, things like that, and Blink still showcasing that, it is here to stick around and stay, and it might not just be a sewers deck after all. Outside of that, anything else below this isn't really too surprising. Amulet Titan still always playable deck, and still has, I would say most of the people who are playing Amulet Titan are usually the people who have been playing Amulet Titan for a while, so it's not surprising that they still put in 15 copies into day 2, with, so many people being so prevalent with the deck or so proficient with the deck type situation. I'm more surprised that 11 copies of Oculus made it into day 2. That deck just doesn't seem well positioned at all. And then 6 of the Storm decks, essentially with Ruby and Belcher, doing well, not too surprising. Moving on here to the top 8 of what happened at this tournament here. So we were able to put in, 1 Amulet Titan got in. We had 3 Grinding Breach decks making it in at 8th place, 4th place, and 2nd place. And then we had 1 Boros Energy in at 5th place. We had 2 Eldrazi Ramps at 3 and 6, and then 1 Orzhov Blink at 7th place. So going through this, if you didn't watch this, I apologize for the spoilers, I guess. But we had Amulet Titan take down Grinding Breach in the first playoff, or first semis, making it into the top 4. We had Boros Energy beating Grinding Breach, making it to the top 4. Of course, one of the Eldrazi Ramps beat the other Eldrazi Ramp, to no surprise, making it to the top 4. And Grinding Breach beating Orzhov Blink, kicking it into the top 4. So, we had, which is pretty good. We had, 4 decks in the top 4 that were all different. Amulet Titan, Boros Energy, Eldrazi Ramp, and Grinding Breach. Amulet Titan taking down Boros Energy to go to the finals, and Grinding Breach taking down Eldrazi Ramp to go to the finals as well. And ultimately, Amulet Titan did take down the tournament here, which is, not surprising, I would say. I'm sure people were surprised that Amulet Titan won the tournament as a whole. People definitely had money on Grinding Breach taking down the whole thing. They did put up 3 copies into the top 8, which is a little wild. That's a really good showing for a deck. Yes, it was the most played deck in the format, or at the tournament, but still putting 3 into the top 8 is kind of crazy. A lot of times you'll see these decks cannibalize themselves because there's so many of them, things like that. So just the fact that they were able to put 3 into the top 8 is huge. Along with, Eldrazi Ramp putting 2 in the top 8 kind of showcases these are probably some of the best decks to be playing as a whole, being able to put in multiple copies into the top 8. That being said, kind of breaking down the top 32, the reason why I went with just the top 32, that was the cutoff to get into the Pro Tour. So you're going to see a lot of people who did a lot of, if you look at the standings, there's a lot of 11 threes and ones. A lot of people were drawing in just to get to the top 32 because that's where you wanted to be at to get into the Pro Tour. That's kind of the ultimate goal for one of these RCs is to make it to the Pro Tour. Obviously, the goal is to win. That's, everyone comes into the tournament going, I want to take down this tournament. I'm going to get first place. But your real goal, I would say, or I would argue the real goal for many players going into this RC, because there's 1,000 and something players in this RC, they were all gunning for at least top 32. That's where they wanted to be at for sure. That gets you into the Pro Tour. That gets you somewhere that a lot of people can't say they've been, right? So out of the top 32, 16 of it was Grinding Breach. So half of the top 32 was Grinding Breach, which is wild to say. Now, whether that was 4-color or teamer, I don't know for sure. I didn't break it down that far. I just kind of wanted to showcase, that 16 of the top 32 was Grinding Breach. So half of the top 32 was Breach. And then Eldrazi Ramp is the next one with 6 copies, making it into the top 32. And then Energy as a whole, that was Jeskai and Boros Energy. With 5 copies, Orzhov Blink with 3, and Amulet Titan with 2. Obviously, Peter, who won the whole thing, and then 10th place was the other one, just on the outside of the top 8 for that top 32 finish. So it is a little crazy of how prevalent Grinding Breach is, and it definitely showcases that this is the deck that is to beat. This is the deck that's going to have a kind of a target on its head moving forward in Charlotte. So definitely going to see probably a lot more hate for Grinding Breach. It'll be interesting to see in Charlotte if the Breach deck can handle all the hate and still ends up putting up a lot of good numbers, or if the hate's going to take out and kind of showcase that Grinding Breach is not the best deck in the format. It doesn't have enough hate or enough people gunning for it to kind of do what it did. So be interesting to see moving forward here in Charlotte, or here for Charlotte, the next month, to see how the RC kind of shakes out and what happens with that as a whole. Kind of going over what I think are the top 3 probably best decks, or the top 3 decks moving forward here in the RC format, and going through probably the RCQs coming up here in just a little bit, because we're going into Modern as the next RCQ season. I definitely think that this Grinding Breach deck is going to be the deck to beat as it stands right now. I think this is pretty obvious, pretty obvious moving forward, that this is kind of what you need to prepare for. You need to have a game plan for in your sideboard, maybe in your 60 as well, with the deck being so popular and so well positioned. So this is the players who got second place in the tournament overall. I just kind of stole their deck list because it would make most sense to do. I'm not sure if their sideboard is the the most optimal thing they can be doing, but the 60 definitely seems to be one of the best 60s out there. It was able to get all the way to second place in the RC, so it clearly did something right. This player opted to play Grape Shot in the main deck instead of playing instead of playing the 2-drop, that name escapes me right now, which I understand. I think Grape Shot allows you to kind of do a lot more proactive things. It lets you clear away board states if you need to, things like that, and just playing Mocked Opal, Mocked Amber, things like that. Just playing a couple of 0-drops or a couple of 1-drops, and then playing a Grape Shot for like 2, 3, 4, and being able to kill a bunch of things is where you want to be at. Playing 3 grinding stations in the main, which I know that's kind of been contested, where you play 2, you play 3, you play 4. We've seen all the numbers essentially of that. So definitely the deck to beat, and I think this is probably what you need to be most prepared for moving forward into the into your RC if you're going to Charlotte, or if you're getting ready to prepare for your RCQs, coming up here. And just I think at the end of March is when RCQ season for Modern starts. So just depending on what you need to be prepared for, essentially. That being said, I also think that Eldrazi Ramp is the next best thing you can be doing in this format. I think that this deck is very well positioned. I think this deck has a lot of things going for it as a whole. I think that the addition of Ancient Stirrings into the main deck is probably where you want to be at for this deck as well. It kind of showcased, being able to find just a couple extra missing pieces. Sometimes this deck runs out of steam, and that's the biggest problem, is that you can't dig deep enough, or you had to use your Eldrazi command to remove a creature or something instead of dig deep through your deck. So all those things going around, I think that Ancient Stirrings is probably the best little pickup for this deck. And then just having the Karn board is really good, and having main deck Karn to help against the grinding station, the Grinding Breach deck is just where you want to be at as a whole. So I think this is the next deck you need to be worried about. I think this deck is probably going to go even higher in popularity at Charlotte. I could be wrong, it could not, but I think this is where you want to be at if you are not playing the Grinding Breach deck. And then the third deck here I'm going to talk about is Orzhov Blink. I think this deck kind of showcased that it is the real deal. It isn't just, a sewers deck. Excuse me, it's not just a sewers deck, it's not just something that's going to be in the trash. I think that with a little bit of tuning in the main deck and maybe in the sideboard some, this deck can have a real good game. I think the biggest problem this deck has as a whole is that against the Grinding Breach decks, it just needs a little bit better answers as a whole. And I know if you listen to anybody who's been playing this deck, they kind of talked about the Grinding Breach deck is something you need to work on. You need to work on that matchup to some degree. It's not the best as a whole. I do think that it's just going to take 1 or 2 people to figure out how to play that matchup a little bit better, and this deck is going to shine just as bright as Eldrazi, and maybe even take over the Eldrazi spot for its percentage. I do think this deck has some real legs. It has some real ability to take down a tournament. I think that this is probably going to take over the spot of Boros Energy as a whole. I think Boros Energy is on the decline just between its Grinding Breach matchup, its Eldrazi matchup. It's spread a little too thin, and I think that Orzhov Blink is primed to take that kind of position as a whole, and kind of get to play, you know, some of these better hate cards and such as well. So time will tell, but I think these are the 3 best decks to take, and these are kind of like the biggest winners from this RC as a whole. You know, we kind of saw Grinding Breach Station is the best deck to be playing. There's no doubt about that. I think Eldrazi is right underneath it, where it has good game against, you know, these mid-range decks, and it has a game plan against, you know, the Eldrazi, or not against the Eldrazi, against the Grinding Station deck as well. So I think that is where you want to be at as a whole if you're not playing the Breach deck. And then I think Orzhov Blink has the chance to kind of eclipse and really rise up here at the next RC in Charlotte. We're just going to take, you know, some dedicated players, figuring out the sideboard, figuring out the main deck maybe a little bit more, and kind of just figuring out, you know, how are we going to answer the Breach deck as a whole. And I think if this deck ever figures out the Breach matchup, it's going to be a scary deck, and something you're going to have to worry about for a long time coming. As always, guys, though, if you like what I'm doing, you like what you're seeing, go ahead and leave a like on the video, subscribe to my channel, and let me know what you guys think is going to take down the next RC in Charlotte. If you think Orzhov Blink is going to do better, or if you think, you know, another deck might come out of the woodworks and surprise everybody. Love to hear from you. I'll catch you guys next time.